So where we left off last time, we've come all the way from Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, all through the time of the judges, and we went through the first couple kings, the first three kings of Israel. So Saul and David. David was the best king, a man after God's own heart, and Solomon was his son. Solomon did some really good stuff, but he also did some really bad stuff. So he built the temple, built the palace, but he also had a crap ton of wives, and he had pagan wives, and they started to pull him away from God. And so God said that because of that, that the kingdom was going to be divided after that. And so I'm going to spare us the in between details of how this happened, but basically, a civil war began between Solomon's son Rehoboam. I realize I started this whole thing without my notes in front of me. That's not a great idea. So let me just open that real quick. I wonder how much I could do just from um, memory. Okay. So you have Jeroboam, who's a guy who's they happen to rhyme. It's very helpful for us when we're trying to, recount what happened, but they're not all related to each other. Rehoboam is Solomon's son. Jeroboam is just a dude. He's in the army, I believe, but he has kind of like a prophet come to him and tell him that he's going to be a ruler over at least part of Israel. And it's interesting because at the beginning, he's this very godly man, and he's like, okay, I'm going to do well by this. But we know what happens to kings, right? As soon as somebody becomes a king, that power goes to their head. And what's the heavy as the head? No, what's the thing I'm always trying to think of? With great power. No, it's the other one. No, it's the other one. The mightier they are, the mightier they fall, or whatever. Anyway, the point is, the kings always fall and they make bad choices. So we have this civil war between Jeroboam, who a prophet told he would have 10 of the 12 tribes. So if you remember back in the day, Jacob was renamed Israel, same guy, had 12 sons. Those 12 sons are the heads of 12 tribes. Those tribes had bazillions of babies. And then after they came out of the wilderness, God kind of gave them each a portion of land, which is on one of your maps. And each of those portions of land is all throughout the area, which we now call, Israel or the Holy Land. But when this all happened, they split. So we had 10 tribes in the northern part of that. So the map that has like the green and the orange will show you the northern 10 tribes and then the southern two tribes. And the southern two tribes are kind of this remnant that were promised on behalf of David way back when God promised that there would always be a line from David that would follow through. Which is also the line of Judah, which is why we call the southern kingdom Judah, because it's one of the tribes that's there, Judah and Benjamin, and all the other tribes are in the north. So we have King Rehoboam in the south, King Jeroboam in the north. Little like mnemonic if you're ever trying to think of this. I don't know why you would be trying to think of the divided kingdom, but if you were, the northern and the southern, I comes before J, so Israel comes before Judah. Israel also gets taken captive before Judah. What else? There's another thing, but I can't remember the other thing. Oh, Israel is in the north, Judah is in the south. I already said that. Okay. So, and then there's a little interesting side story that happens with, let's see, Jeroboam and most of the people from Israel. So Jeroboam has more people, right? Because he has 10 tribes. He goes to Rehoboam. Now, Rehoboam keeps Jerusalem, which is the capital. And so Rehoboam and his two tribes are in the capital area, which means they're with the temple and all this jazz. So Jeroboam and his people go to Rehoboam and they say, hey, and this is before they're in full on unrest, civil war. They're still trying to figure out how they're going to like divvy things up and whatever. And he says, there's such a heavy workload on all our people. Can you do something to make the workload less? It's just so oppressive right now. And Rehoboam is this young king. He's Solomon's son, and he does this interesting thing where he calls in all his like normal advisors, and they're all these old men, and he says to them like, should I do anything about the workload for these people that they say they're just like, super oppressed? And the old men say, yes, you should back off and make life easier for them. Like that will make things go well for you as a king, and it also will be the kind thing to do. And he's like, I don't like that advice. So then he reaches out to all his own like bros, and he calls in his friends who are all super young, and he's like, well, what do you guys think? And they're like, no, make it harder, because the whole might makes right thing. Like if you lead with, kind of fear and terror, then like you'll really have them. And so he does. He makes things even more difficult for the people with taxes and work and slavery. And so they're like, okay, screw this. And that kind of entrenches the Civil War even more. So now we have the northern tribes and the southern tribes. And the sort of pattern that's going to happen all throughout this, we are not going to go, this is the list of like all the kings. We are certainly not going to go through this whole list. First of all, some of these kings had a very short lived, they reigned for like 6 months or 2 years. One guy, 7 days, poor Zimri, he got assassinated. And then Omri took over. But in the north you have kings, in the south you have kings. Often they would sort of war between each other or work well with each other, back and forth it went, but they were definitely separate territories, separate kings, and separate problems. But the thing they all have in common, except for the ones with a heart next to them, so you can see out of all these kings, only 4 have a heart next to them. All of these kings were bad kings. In fact, if you go on gotquestions.org, I just happened to go on yesterday, it lists next to them like very bad, despicable, mean, violent, the worst. Like it lists all of these descriptors. But the number one reason why they all are considered bad kings is not just because they were oppressive over their people, it's because they sold out the tribes of Israel and Judah to pagan gods and pagan worship. Let me say a quick word about this because we're going to be talking about this at the end. When I say that they were doing pagan worship and serving these other gods and worshiping idols and stuff like that, it sounds like, yeah, because we don't really operate that way today. I mean, we have our own versions, but this was a really big deal, not only because it was rebelling against God and saying, I don't care about the God that rescued us and the God that made us and all these things. It was also really violent and like screwed up things like killing children, ripping open pregnant women because they thought it would expand their borders, eating people. Like it was disgusting practices. And God kept saying, the more you inch into this kind of pagan worship and worshiping the constellation and worshiping all these goddesses of fertility and the Baals and stuff, the more that happens, the more they're going to pull you into this world where you think it's fine. In fact, when we get to our focus story tonight, they're like surprised at the fact that they're not supposed to be doing those things. That's how far entrenched it is into their culture that they're like, oh, we're not supposed to be killing infants? Huh. Like it's just such a regular cultural thing because it's just crept in. So it's not like he's just like, I don't want you to have a pastime. It's like, I don't want you to give your full allegiance and do all these terrible things in the name of these other gods. Okay. So we've got Jeroboam, Rehoboam. Jeroboam is now away from Jerusalem, so the people can't go to the temple to do worship and make sacrifices. And so he thinks, I'll just make like our own spots, which is probably a really bad idea. Because what ends up happening, of course, is that he builds out high places and altars and these kinds of things, which are almost immediately given over to these other gods. When you read through the Old Testament, you're going to see the phrase high places a lot. Most of the time, not all the time, most of the time, that's a reference to a place that pagan worship was happening. Because what people would do, and sometimes the Israelites would do this too, but mostly it was not the Israelites, is they would either find a high place, like a hill or a mountain or something, or they would build something up, think a miniature version of the ziggurats that we talked about. And then they would put either like an Asherah pole or a stone tower or a wood pole or something that they would then worship, and they would make sacrifices there, and sometimes they would put bones there and all this kind of stuff. But it was all, if you picture like a movie of weird pagan ritual worship and all the voodoo crazy stuff that was going on with that, that's what was happening in these places. And there was also like temple prostitution happening, prostitution outside of the temple, but on behalf of these gods or whatever. Okay. So the strange thing happens that I'm only telling you about because we're going to read about it later, hundreds of years later. This random dude comes to tell Jeroboam that what he's doing is bad. And he curses the altar. It's like very like, it's like a movie, like, curse the altar, curse all of this pagan worship. And I'm telling you that God does not like this. And one day it's not going to go well for you. But this guy, Josiah, who we're going to be talking about, who's going to come on the scene hundreds of years later, one day he'll be born to the house of David, and he is going to undo all this crap you guys are doing now. Jeroboam, the king, says, I don't like this. And he cries out against the guy. I don't even think is named, the prophet, I guess. And he points his finger at the guy. And as he's pointing his finger, his hand shrivels up right in front of everybody. And then he begs the prophet Can you do something? So then the prophet pleads to God on his behalf, and his arm like grows back. Crazy Bible. And still then he says, nope, I'm gonna actually just he says, the Bible says, even after this, Jeroboam did not change his evil ways, but once more appointed priests for the high places from all sorts of people. Anyone who wanted to become a priest, he consecrated for the high places. This would be like people nowadays going to like churchofloveandlight.com and being ordained. This was the sin of the house of Jeroboam that led to its downfall and to its destruction from the face of the earth. Most of the stories I'm telling tonight are coming from not most, all the stories I'm telling tonight are coming from Kings and Chronicles, but I'm usually using Kings just because it tends to be a little more storytelling. So that just gives you a picture. Jeroboam was not the worst king. It's just a like microcosm because we're not going to go through them all. But like I said, we got 10 tribes, 2 tribes, lots of kings. And as this is happening right after Solomon has died. So starting in about 930, and we go all the way through till the northern kingdom is taken over by the Assyrians in 722. Then a couple hundred years more pass almost, and the southern kingdom is finally taken by the Babylonians. So let's pause and talk about those powers that are happening, because meanwhile in the world, while Israel, this tiny little, in the grand scheme of things, tiny little, community. I mean, it's many, many people. It's hundreds of thousands of people, but compared to the rest of the world, they're not really on the world stage as like an empire. What's happening in the world during this span of time? Homer writes the Iliad and the Odyssey in 800 BC. In Greece in 776 BC, we have the Olympic Games beginning. We have the founder of Jainism being born in India, Mahavira, in 599 BC. So there's just some little fun facts. But the two big things that we're going to pay attention to are the Assyrian and then Neo-Assyrian Empire and the Babylonian and then Neo-Babylonian Empire. Basically, these are the two collections of city-states that start to form these big empires. The Syrians are first. I mean, they're both things are happening. The Syrians come on the scene and then Babylonians sort of to follow. The Assyrians are the big bad guys for a while. Then they start to die out, and then the Babylonians kind of take over as the big bad guys. But they, for a long time, are at war with each other. The Assyrians are the continuation of some of the people we talked about way back in the first one of these that we did when we talked about the flood and Tower of Babel, and we talked about Nimrod and all that. Sorry. So remember we talked about Sargon the Great, and that we think that's actually who Nimrod was. There's so many Sargons. There's Sargon the Great and Sargon the First and Sargon the Second and Sargon the 11th or whatever. I don't know, but the main city for a while is Asher, and so that's where we get the word Assyria from that. So we've gone from just basic like Sumerian, Mesopotamian city states, and now we have a sort of a collection of city states. Asher being the capital for a while. And then the capital turns into Nineveh. Does anybody know why Nineveh is relevant in Bible history? It sounds familiar, right? What? Who said that? Yes, it's where Jonah was called to go. And on the map, I didn't put this on there, but like, if you look where Jerusalem is, I'm trying to think let me see somebody's map for a second. Let me see this one. Yeah. Well, let me see a bigger one. Yeah, I'm gonna further out. So Jonah's like hanging out in Israel, right? He's supposed to go to Nineveh, which is like here, if you can do it on the big map, right? But he goes all across to Tarshish, which is essentially Spain. Y'all, he was running hard from the Lord, but that's just extra because we're going to talk about that next time. Anyway, but Nineveh is another eventual capital city of the Assyrians. A big name in Assyrian empire building is Tiglath-Pileser. There's the first one and then the second one. Both are like, if you were to go study Neo-Assyrian Empire, these are the names that would come up. He focused on a lot of northern conquests during David and Solomon's reign. So Israel kind of got left alone by him, like they weren't attacked by him yet because he was trying to build his way up. If you think of Assyria and Babylon, they're both between the Tigris and the Euphrates in, that Mesopotamian area. They're sort of moving north up to modern day Syria. Babylon is going to focus more on the southern part. Assyria is going to focus more on the northern part, but of course they're constantly battling each other as well. Let's see. So he wrote a law code, Tiglath-Pileser, which was far more brutal than the Sumerian and Babylonian codes. So later, when we talk about Babylon, we'll hear about like Hammurabi. We've all heard that name, Hammurabi's code. Hammurabi's code was relatively reasonable given its time. I mean, now it's not reasonable, but given its time, it was well thought out and fair-ish. The Assyrians were known though for being brutal, leading with violence, awful. I mean, they're like, and this is not something we know from the Bible. This is what we know from archaeology artifacts. They were known for skinning men alive, flaying them, taking their flayed flesh and putting them on towers, taking their skinned alive bodies, stacking them up, stacking heads on trees. I mean, to keep enemies at bay, knowing like this will happen to you too. I mean, they showed no mercy, no mercy. And they're known for being super violent, super aggressive, which was a immediately helpful tool for them, but it didn't actually bear out to keep the empire going. Um, anyway, so let's see. Oh, didn't want to do that. Sorry. Okay. Another name you might know, he comes on the scene much later, Sennacherib, if you remember that from history. He comes on the scene right after Israel is taken. But Shalmaneser III, he extended the Assyrian rule to the Persian Gulf and then into Palestine. So now he's getting into the territory where our people are for our purposes, our story. And so he actually forced the Israelite King Jehu, who is on your chart here. He'll be on the right side, the one that's right under 850 BC. Jehu, he asked him, or he forced him to pay tribute. In fact, we don't know that from the Bible. We know that only from ancient Assyrian artifacts. So we can start to see the infiltration. And at first, both Assyria and Babylon would do things like try to get taxes out of them, try to sort of oppress them lightly, like make them vassal states until they finally were like, screw it, we're taking you into captivity and burning things down. Tiglath-Pileser III rebuilt the Assyrian Empire and eventually conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. And some think it was Sargon II, his son. So if you fact check me later, but it was one of those two. Interestingly enough, if you think about the New Testament, where you hear people talking about the Samaritans, like the story of the Good Samaritan, how Samaritans were hated, it's because it starts here. Samaria was the capital of the northern kingdom. And so when the Assyrians took it over and like sacked the capital, they inserted a bunch of Assyrian people into Samaria and left some of the Israelites behind, such that they mixed and mingled and remarried. And so later Jews would see them as this like gross mixed race because they were mixed with the enemy, you know? So that's kind of where that comes from, which I think is interesting. It's terrible, but it kind of sheds some light on New Testament stuff. You may have heard of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. When the Assyrians took these 10 tribes, they think something in the neighborhood of 28,000 Israelites were taken. They were never seen again. So no one really knows for sure if they just scattered throughout Assyria's kingdom, if they like assimilated into their culture and sort of got like culturally lost, or if they migrated to different parts of the world. There are some tribes of people that turned into little pockets of people in like India and as far up north as like Ireland that will claim Jewish descent. And they think maybe it's part of those 10 quote lost tribes, but no one really knows. So later, when we talk about all of the people in captivity and the exile, we're really going to be looking all the people that were taken by Babylon, because the Assyrian ones just sort of into the wind. Interesting. So that's Assyrians. The Babylonian Empire gets started a little bit later, though it's interesting. Babylon, the city itself, modern day Iraq, it like sort of worked with the Assyrians a lot. Even when the Assyrians were anti-Babylonian, they still would preserve the city of Babylon just because it was a mecca. It was an epicenter of art and culture and philosophy and reason. And now the day did come when one of the kings of Assyria got so mad because his son got hurt and all this stuff that he finally did just like level it. But up until then, it was sort of this like love-hate relationship kind of thing. Babylonians are from the Akkadian origin. So back in our first and second ones, we were talking about Akkadia and Akkadian language and Akkadian kings. That's what would later develop into what we now call Babylonian and Neo-Babylonian Empire. The first kind of great king was Hammurabi. And you guys know he introduced the code of law that was relatively reasonable. Interestingly enough, you probably heard me say when we were talking about like Leviticus and stuff and God giving the law to the Israelites, and we think of that law being so restrictive and strict. And I said then that it was light years more reasonable than Hammurabi's code, and Hammurabi's code was light years more reasonable than the Assyrians. So it's interesting that God is saying what's happening in culture, I'm gonna condescend and come down to you, but I'm gonna lift you up to the next level, and then I'm gonna lift you up to the next level, and on it goes. Let's see. I already said the city of Babylon was a constant thorn in the side of Assyria. Um, at some point, Babylon, the Babylonians allied with the Medes and the Persians, which would get them in trouble later. It helped them in the short run, but in the long run, they get taken over by Persia, but that's for next time. Um, but with that little alliance, they did defeat the Assyrian army in 616, and then Nabopolassar. I've listened to various podcasts of people talking about this, and they all like say it differently. But anyway, he was a Babylonian who served as a general in the Assyrian army. So he's working for the north, but he doesn't like it because he's Babylonian. And after the death of a certain Assyrian king, he led a rebellion against the Assyrian Empire and thus becoming the first king of the newly independent Babylon or Babylonian Empire in 625 BC. They destroyed Nineveh, which fulfilled a prophecy of Nahum. I'm not talking about prophets a lot tonight because we're getting so much history that I'm going to save that for its own storytelling night where we're just going to talk about what are prophets, what do they do, what are some major ones, what are some major themes, and then we'll tell a bunch of stories like Elijah and the prophets of Baal and all that kind of stuff. I just figured if I tried to work that into this, we would never get time for discussion. So Nahum is a tiny little book in the Bible, which is a prophecy against Nineveh. And it's weird because if you read it in the Bible, it's not weird, but it's if you read it in the Bible and you don't know all of this, you're like, why is there a prophecy against this like random city? Like, why are we reading this? Why is this in the Bible? But when you start studying world history, you realize Nineveh was it, right? It was the capital of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Then Babylon defeated it and took it over. So now it's Babylon's place. It's full of pagan idolatry. It's a symbol of kind of like if you own Nineveh, you own the empire kind of thing. And it would be a fulfillment of prophecy, one of thousands of times in the Bible where you read it here and then hundreds of years later, the thing happens. Pretty cool. Let's see. Where am I? The Assyrian Empire finally eliminated by Babylon in 605 BC. That's when Nebuchadnezzar becomes the king. Nebuchadnezzar II becomes the king of Babylon. Does anybody know where we hear that name in the Bible? No big deal if you don't, but Nebuchadnezzar? Yeah. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. What does it mean? Know what book of the Bible that's in? Yes. So that's for a future Bible study. But when we study the book of Daniel, he's the big bad king there who ends up like having to become an animal in the field. It's really cool. But anyway, but in 597, he captured Jerusalem. So this is about 10 years before the full conquest. And he took a bunch of the noblemen, the officers, and the craftsmen from Jerusalem. But he kind of left the rest alone, right? Which, by the way, and he also took a bunch of treasure and money from the temple and the royal palace, which fulfills another prophecy from Second Kings. And then 9 years later, King Zedekiah, which is, I guess, probably the one of the last ones on here, right? Let's see. I lost him. Yeah, he's the last one. Poor guy, he tries to rebel against Babylonian rule. It does not go well. Nebuchadnezzar just lays siege to Jerusalem and finally just finishes the job this time and destroys the whole thing, destroys the temple. That's when the temple is destroyed. That was built in 953 by Solomon. And Nebuchadnezzar is the one that we think built the Hanging Gardens for his Persian wife. But there's actually no archaeological evidence of the Hanging Gardens. It's just like storytelling. Some people think it actually is up in Nineveh, but anyway, I am not going to take a stance on that. But all of this to say that all of this stuff is happening with these two big empires. Meanwhile, Israel is just whoring itself out to these other gods, other than the stories that I'm just going to tell you. And in doing so, God keeps saying, I mean, it almost gets annoying how many times it's kind of like in Judges where we get the same pattern repeating. Here we get the same pattern repeating. They like worship these other gods, and our God, the real God says, if you keep doing this, I am going to basically just remove my hand of protection. I'm not going to attack you. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm just going to let what like nature run its course, like instead of putting my hand of protection, I'm just going to be like, let's see what happens. Let's see what the Assyrians have to say about that, or the Babylonians. And so that's what happens. They get taken into captivity. 2 Kings 17 says all this, and this is the captivity. took place because the Israelites had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of Egypt from under the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. They worshiped other gods. I'm not going to keep reading because I see the time going, but it's just a little paragraph that kind of says, this is why that's happening. And it keeps saying it and keeps saying it. And they just don't believe it until, and by the way, we get some of the worst Psalms, laments, uh, prophet writings in the Bible when they are taken into captivity. It's like they finally get how bad it could have been because it finally is that bad. In fact, and I wasn't planning on telling you this tonight, but the probably the worst verse in the Bible, if I were an atheist, the verse that I would go to every time to say how terrible Christianity is the verse that talks about blessed will be the day that we can bash your babies on rocks. Have you heard that? It's a horrible verse in the Psalms. And you're like, why in the world would the psalmist say something so terrible? Well, if you read at the beginning of the psalm, it says a psalm given after being taken into captivity. It's right after they're taken into Babylonian captivity. And what's happened preceding that, if you know your history and you know your Bible, is that they have killed people, bashed their babies on rocks, done all these terrible things. And then they pull some of the Israelites out into captivity and they say to them, when they're on the heels of just this heartache beyond heartache, they say, sing us a song. You sing your songs, right? Like you Israelites, you love your songs because, and the psalmist is the one doing this, right? The singer. And they're like, sing a song. Like, how would you feel if I was like, sing us a song about joy in life on a horrible day? So they sing the song in their own language where they're basically like, one day we wish this on you. And so the song is like, blessed will be the day that we get vengeance, like that we can do the terrible things that you've done to us. So point is, captivity, really terrible, but they took themselves right into it. What I want to do for our focus story, instead of just going through all of these and telling you like, and he reigned 1 year and then he was taken over. By the way, did you notice there's a queen in here? Hey, there's a queen, and we're going to hear about a female prophetess, which is cool. So there's some women folk up in there. She wasn't good though, sadly, but she was there. But the story I want to hone in on is the story of Josiah, one of the very few good kings who did something pretty amazing and unheard of in the history of Israel. And has anybody, and I'm saying Israel because I'm thinking of all of this as the Israelites, but he's in the kingdom of Judah. Okay. Excuse me. Has anybody heard the story of Josiah? Jordan, I'm guessing you have. You have, kind of, maybe? I'm hoping it's new to most of you.
Yeah, I have.
Okay. So basically what happens is Josiah sends, this is like just part and parcel of his job. He sends, I'm going to spare you all the names of like the servant goes to the priest, goes to the whatever, but he sends a messenger to another messenger to another to go collect the money from the temple. People would bring money to the temple, and that was sort of a tax they would use for various things. And he says, go and get the money, do these like normal run of the mill things, bring it back to me. I don't need you to keep account of your own whatever because I trust you. So, but while they're in the temple, and it just is this like throwaway verse, some dude finds this book, a scroll, the book of the law. It is, and we don't know how much it is, but it's some part of the Torah, and it's dusty and it's some corner, and they're just moving stuff around, and they find this thing, and then they bring it back to all these messengers, and they say to Josiah, we found this scroll, and they read it aloud to him. And I don't know how much they read, and I don't know what it was from. It's presumably from the first 5 books of the Bible, but I'm sure it had something to say about pagan worship and pagan gods and how they should be worshiping and how they should be allotting their money and their time and all these things. And he hears it being read out loud, and he realizes that they are so far from what they're supposed to be doing. And he just breaks down. He weeps. He tears his clothes. This is a thing that would happen in ancient Near East when someone would be in like full repentance. They would tear their clothes because it was a symbol of being vulnerable and naked, to say like, I am open to you, Lord. I am vulnerable, and I'm admitting, I'm being exposed to like admit how wrong I have been on behalf of all the people. He tore his robes. You guys have this scripture in front of you. I'm on verse 12. It says, he gave these orders: go and inquire of the Lord for me and for the people and for all of Judah against about what is written in this book and what has been found. Great is the Lord's anger that burns against us, because those who have gone before us have not obeyed the words of this book. They have not acted in accordance with all that was written. So then there's this other, anytime you see the dot, dot, dot thing, it's because I took text out just to spare you all the big names, but you can go read it. So he inquires of this prophet. Turns out it's a lady, Huldah. She's a female prophet, and she sends this message back saying, this is what the Lord Israel says. I'm going to bring disaster on this place, according to everything written, because they've forsaken me. They've burned incense to their gods. They've harassed, blah, blah, blah. It's the same thing we've heard so many times in the Bible, right? But the message from Huldah also says, this is bolded in verse 19, but because Josiah, your heart was responsive and you humbled yourself before the Lord when you heard what I've spoken against this place and his people, and because you tore your robes and wept in my presence, I also have heard you, declares the Lord. Therefore, I will gather you to your ancestors and you'll be buried in peace. Your eyes will not see all the disaster I'm going to bring on this place. So basically, God is saying disaster is still coming because a lot of wrong has been done. But because there's something, a genuine heart change happening in Josiah, like this little pocket of history is going to be spared. And it is. And it just so happens that the story of Josiah um, happens right as Assyria is tumbling and Babylon is building. And so in that space, they don't have any room or space to worry about what's happening with Josiah and his tiny little kingdom. And so they're kind of in a prosperous time. So what Josiah does is, so he repents and then he renews the covenant between himself and all the people and God. He calls them all together, calls all the elders, goes up to the temple, and he makes this statement, and he makes the people, and the people say it with him, like, we are renewing our covenant with the Lord. We are not going to keep living like we've been living. This is like revival is happening, right? Like everyone's raising their hand and saying, like, I'm in. We don't want to do this anymore. It's interesting because how is he so surprised by the law? It's been that long since a king has even read it. And if you remember when we talked way back about what a king should do with that whole thing about don't have too many horses and don't have pagan wives and all that jazz, one of the things that it said that was Deuteronomy 17, it says that the king should keep make a copy of their own scroll of the Torah and keep it with them day and night and read it daily. And it's saying that for a reason. And we're going to talk about that in our discussion questions. But that hadn't happened for a hot minute. And the fact that they're like so surprised by all this is crazy. So then Josiah, I'm not going to read this all out loud, but he cleans house. Like he does something that has never been done before in Israel and probably never since, where he just goes on a rampage destroying anything that's not godly. So and then this came at a great cost to him, like a literal cost because he destroyed stuff, especially because a lot of stuff had been like consecrated to other gods. So like chariots, something that's not like a worship instrument, but be like, well, this chariot has been blessed and saged and whatever, but for this other god. So we don't want any of that. Burn it. So a great cost to his kind of reputation because people are like, he's crazy to do that, but also a financial cost. But he's like, nope, at whatever cost, I am taking this down to the studs, as it were, right? So he removes all of the articles made for Baal and Asherah that are in the temple. You keep reading this next part where after it says Josiah completely cleans house, it's like half the stuff is in the temple. Can you imagine going into your church and bringing like, I don't know, an altar for Satan or some Wiccan, whatever, or like whatever the thing is, right? That would be insane. Or you've got like voodoo chalk in the parlor, like what? Anyway, but that's what's happening. He did away with the priests. He took the Asherah pole from the temple of the Lord. He's burning things. He tears down the quarters where the male shrine prostitutes were. In verse 10, I bolded and underlined this because it says he desecrated Topheth, which is in the valley of Ben Hinnom, so no one could use it to sacrifice their son or daughter in the fire to Molech. If you guys have heard me talking about this before, one of Molech and Chemosh are two of the really terrible pagan gods. And just to reiterate, when I say gods, I'm using small g. I don't think that those gods really existed. I think they are dark, fallen angels that are acting as gods and asking for really horrible things. And one of the things they would do is build these tall statues, often like bronze or part bronze, where maybe it'd have a bull head or something like that. And they would put an actual working oven in the abdomen of it. And they would have outstretched arms made of bronze. They would heat up the fire, get it very hot. So the whole thing was fiery hot. And then they would lay infants and toddlers in the arms to burn them alive. And then they would have the musicians playing instruments loudly so that you didn't have to hear the 816, so that they didn't have to hear the cries of the child or the weeping mothers. I mean, it's so terrible. And it's like, they're all like, oh, huh, I guess we shouldn't have been doing that. What in the world? How far gone are you that you don't realize you shouldn't be killing children? Like, anyway. Verse 12, he pulled down the altars the kings of Judah had erected on the roof near the upper room, blah, blah. I'm not saying blah, blah because I'm trying to be sacrilegious to the Bible. I just want to get us to the point where we can talk. You get the point. Skipping down to verse 17, just because I told you that weird story at the beginning about the guy cursing the altars and the shriveled hand and everything. In verse 17, the king, this is Josiah, asked, he's going through these tombstones. What tombstone is this, right? What tombstone is this I see? People of the city says, this marks the tomb of the man of God who came from Judah and pronounced against the altar of Bethel the very things you have done to it. So the guy that talked to Jeroboam 500 years prior, this is his tombstone. And he says, okay, we'll leave it alone, let no one disturb it. And so they didn't. I just think it's funny. There's a nod to that guy. He never gets a name. Poor guy. And then the last thing he does, and I'm just going to tell you instead of reading it. And this was the thing that was particularly powerful to me as I prepared this lesson. He reinstitutes the Passover. And what it says is, so the Passover feast is where they celebrate God rescuing the Israelites in the Exodus, right? Is rescuing them from Egypt. And when the Lord passed over the houses of the Israelites and spared them death and then pulled them out, right? The feast of the Passover is supposed to be a time to remember when God rescued them so that you hold him in your heart as not just this, like, I tower over you and I control you, but like, I love you, I forgive you, I give you grace, I give you mercy, I rescue you. But they hadn't been celebrating this Passover. It says something like that they hadn't been celebrating it. Oh, here we go. Neither in the days of the judges who led Israel, nor in the days of the kings of Israel, had any such Passover been observed. That's a long time, y'all. Many hundreds of years. We're going all the way back to the judges that they weren't celebrating Passover. Anyway, and then it talks about never before had they seen a feast as the one that Josiah did when he was like, well, we're going to celebrate Passover and we're going hard. And a bunch of bulls were killed and they partied. So a few thoughts and then we'll get to our discussion questions. I already told you about how God specifically gave the rule to the kings to keep the Torah close. I don't have to say that. Let's see. I think it's really interesting that the Lord hears Josiah's prayer of repentance and he honors it. And I take comfort in that because for so many years, people hadn't been doing that. You almost wonder if God sort of stopped listening. Like it might have felt that way. But all Josiah had to do was recognize this is the book that represents what Yahweh wants from us. We're not doing it. Oh no, like, oh my gosh, this is so awful. And when he realizes that and he repents, instantly, practically, God says to him, okay, because you repented, like you will see peace. You will not see the destruction that's coming. And then I think I have like one little thoughts written here, but I said them already. So that is the story of Josiah. And then he's one of these kings. So all of the stuff that you have in your handouts is just maps to kind of show you what's happening. And then a list of like all the kings and where they fall with prophets. But we are going to tackle prophets in a whole other night. So I'm going to stop the recording and then we shall discuss. Let's see. I have to figure out how to do that. Sorry. Discuss amongst yourselves. Oh, there we go.